The wind that morning came crawling out of the canyon, dry, whispering, and carrying the scent of iron. Marshal Elias Boone rode into Red Hollow with the dawn behind him, his horse's hooves muffled by dust thick as smoke. Folks said he'd come to hang the witch who'd cursed the Silver Creek mine. Others said he'd come to silence a secret the town had buried 6 years ago. He wasn't sure himself anymore. Inside his saddlebag sat a weathered leather journal, the Outlaws, the woman's. Her name was Cora Finch. The ink inside bled like old wounds. "If they find this, they'll think me mad," one page read. But madness was born here, not in me. Boone had read those words 10 times before reaching town, and each time his hand drifted to the revolver at his hip, then away again. Red Hollow looked smaller than he remembered. The saloon still leaned east like a drunk, and the church steeple wore a bullet hole just beneath its cross. Outside the jailhouse, 3 women in mourning black stood like shadows. Behind them, the gallows beam stretched against the pale sky. And beneath it, waiting, was her. Cora Finch, barefoot, rope mark already burned into her wrist from the night they dragged her out of the cabin. She stood calm, eyes on the horizon where the canyon met the sun. Boone dismounted. The silence of the crowd pressed close, thick as a hanging fog. "Marshal," Reverend Hale said, stepping forward, voice tight, "we appreciate your swiftness. Justice has been patient long enough." Boone didn't answer. He just handed his reins to a boy, maybe 12, freckles lost under soot, and climbed the wooden steps toward her. Cora looked at him, and for a moment something flickered across her face. Not fear. Recognition. "You're late," she said quietly. The words struck deeper than any bullet. That night, when he opened the Outlaw's journal again by the lamplight of the jailhouse, Boone found the letter folded between the pages. The paper was yellowed, written in a fine hand, sealed once with wax long broken. It wasn't addressed to him, yet it carried his name in the corner. "To Elias Boone, if the Lord still lets you read." His breath caught as he read. "You remember the fire at Bitter Mesa? You remember the children they blamed me for. You remember because you were there. You saw who struck the match." The lamp flickered. Outside, thunder rolled low across the dry plains, though the sky hadn't seen rain in months. Boone's hand trembled. He folded the letter shut. Tomorrow, at sunrise, he was meant to hang her. But for the first time in 20 years of killing, he couldn't remember why. Yet the night stretched long and hollow. Cora hummed a tune in her cell, something from before the war, before shame had a name. Boone sat by the bars, his revolver on the table, the letter before him, and wondered if justice ever had a sound. When dawn touched the desert, he poured himself one last cup of coffee, black as remorse, and said under his breath, "Maybe I came here to kill a memory." Outside, the gallows waited. The morning came sharp and red, the kind that smells of rust and judgment. Cora Finch stood under the gallows beam, her shadow long and thin against the dust. Her wrists were bound, the rope rough and dark from other necks before hers. The crowd had gathered, farmers, widows, miners with blackened nails. They came not for justice, but for relief. Boone could feel it, the hunger of it. He stepped up beside her, hat low, revolver heavy on his belt. The Reverend read from a Bible that shook in his hands. His voice was a cracked bell. "And the Lord shall deliver the wicked into the pit they have dug." Cora smiled then, just barely. "Careful, Reverend," she said softly. "You'll fall in first." A ripple of unease cut through the crowd. Someone spat. Someone else muttered, "Witch?" Boone said nothing. He was looking at her wrists. The rope burns there, old and new, as if the world had been trying to hang her since birth. 6 years ago, Boone had ridden through Bitter Mesa. He remembered the smoke, the smell of tallow and burnt timber. They'd found bodies, 3 children, and the woman accused of calling down the fire. Cora Finch, the widow with the pale eyes. He remembered her face through the smoke. She hadn't cried then either. He remembered the man who stood beside him, Sheriff Danton, drunk on God and gold, swearing he'd seen her near the mine with a torch. Boone had believed him, until he read the letter. "The mine was burning before I got there," it said. "They were hiding something under that hill. Not gold, not silver. Bones." "Got any last words?" Reverend Hale asked, voice like sandpaper. Cora tilted her head, the sun turning her hair to tarnished copper. "Only this," she said. "The truth don't die when you hang the tongue that spoke it." Someone threw a stone. It struck her shoulder, left a dark bloom of blood on her white dress. Boone's hand went to his revolver, then froze, mid-motion. The crowd roared louder now, that kind of noise that makes men forget they ever had mothers. "Hang her! Witch!" She cursed the mine. And in that chaos, Boone's eyes caught something strange, a small figure at the edge of the crowd. A child, barefoot, hair wild, clutching a piece of paper against her chest. She pushed through the adults, voice high and trembling. "Marshal, you dropped this." She held out another page from the Outlaw's journal, torn clean. Boone stepped down, took it with shaking fingers. The handwriting was the same. But the words. They said he'd come for me. The marshal. They said he'd kill me. But he was there too when the children burned. He felt the world tilt. Thunder rumbled again, though still no rain. Boone looked at Cora. Her calmness was unbearable now, like she already knew what he'd just read. "Marshal," the Reverend hissed, "do your duty." Boone's hand went to the lever. His thumb hesitated. The crowd leaned forward, vultures made of cloth and dust. Then Cora spoke, her voice steady as wind. "You saw it, didn't you?" she whispered. "In the letter. The name they buried with the children." Boone didn't answer, but the look in his eyes told her everything. The child still stood there, trembling, staring up at the gallows. And then, with the smallest, bravest voice that had ever crossed the desert, she said, "Please, don't." That word cut through the mob like a blade. For the first time, someone's hand dropped from a pitchfork. Another looked away. Boone took a step back. His hand left the lever. The Reverend's Bible fell to the ground. And Cora Finch, the woman who wouldn't beg, lifted her chin toward the sun and smiled. The desert keeps its dead close. Every trail, every dry creek bed, holds the echo of someone's last breath. Boone had ridden through enough ashes to know that ghosts don't rise from graves. They rise from silence. That night, he rode west with Cora, chained behind him on the mule, not toward the prison fort, but toward Bitter Mesa, where her story had first bled into his. The crowd hadn't stopped them. The child's single plea had cracked something open in Red Hollow. Not mercy, but hesitation. Sometimes that's enough to save a life for one more night. The land changed as they rode. Mesquite trees leaning like old men, wind pushing heat into their bones. The mesa rose ahead, black and wide under the silver moon. Boone remembered this place. The mine entrance collapsed years ago. The fires that took 3 children, and the only piece of his conscience that had ever been worth a damn. He remembered Sheriff Danton's words that night. The widow was seen here. Burn her, and the curse will die. He hadn't questioned it. He'd just watched the flames. Now, standing before that same mound of rock and ruin, Cora's voice cut through him like a nail. They buried them there, she said, pointing to a patch of caved earth near the mine. Not the children, they're proof. Boone dismounted, lantern trembling in his grip. Proof of what? She met his eyes. That the mine wasn't silver. It was grave dust. The lantern light flickered over the rocks, and he saw it. Not ore, not stone, but shards of bone. Small, white, child-sized. The ground breathed out a smell like rust and rot. Boone staggered back, bile rising in his throat. Cora knelt beside the earth, her shackles clinking. They dug up an old burial ground, she said quietly. The miners hit bones instead of gold. They hid it, kept digging. Then the sickness came. The children died. They called it a curse. They called me a witch because I buried them proper. Her fingers brushed the dirt, gentle, like prayer. Boone's lantern shook harder. He remembered now the coughing, the fever that spread through town, the preacher shouting about damnation while men dropped in the street. Why didn't you run? He asked. I did, she said. They followed. A sound drifted through the still air. Coyotes, distant, the kind that sound almost human when the night is lonely enough. Boone knelt, rubbing his jaw. The letter said there was a name, he murmured. Who struck the match? Cora's eyes burned in the half-light. You already know. And he did. Sheriff Danton, drunk, desperate, covering up the truth for the mine owners. He'd blamed her to save his own soul, and Boone had helped him do it. The wind rose, scattering sand like ash. Cora stood. You can hang me, Marshal, or you can burn what's left of their lies. Boone looked at the ground again. The bones, the broken timbers, the sign that once marked the mine entrance, Bitter Mesa Silver Company. He drew his revolver, cocked it, and fired into the sign. Once, twice. The echo rolled down the canyon. Then he kicked the lantern over, and the flames took. They watched in silence as the fire licked up the old boards, devouring history. When it reached the symbol of the company, a silver brand shaped like a serpent, it melted down into the earth. Cora turned away, tears cutting clean tracks through the dust on her cheeks. Boone reached out without meaning to, brushed the rope burn on her wrist. She flinched, then didn't. You still think I'm a witch? She asked softly. He shook his head. No, just the only one here who remembers what mercy looks like. The fire's glow lit her face. Not pure, not saintly, but real. Tired, defiant. And when dawn came, the mine was gone. Only a smoking pit and a pile of bones remained. Boone buried them proper this time, without words. When he finished, he took off his badge and laid it atop the mound. Cora watched him. That won't buy you redemption, she said. I ain't looking to buy it, he replied, just to earn it a little slower. She almost smiled. As they left Bitter Mesa, Boone looked back once. The sun broke over the ridge, turning the ashes into gold for just a breath. Cora said quietly, "Now the desert remembers too." And for the first time, Boone believed her. The sun climbed slow that day, not golden, not gentle, but white and mean, like a judge who'd already decided the verdict. By the time Boone and Cora reached the river bend, the horses were lathered, and silence hung between them, like a wound that wouldn't close. They made camp near the cottonwoods. Boone set a small fire, its smoke curling straight up through still air. The sound of the river was the only thing alive, a low rush, steady as breathing. He hadn't slept in 2 nights. Each time he closed his eyes, he saw the bones under Bitter Mesa and the face of that child in the crowd, her small voice breaking the weight of a mob. He reached into his coat pocket, pulled out the rope they'd meant to hang Cora with. He didn't know why he'd kept it. Maybe because guilt has a habit of looking like proof. He tossed it into the fire. The hemp caught slow, then fast, curling into flame that hissed like a dying snake. Cora watched, arms around her knees. "That won't burn it off you," she murmured. Boone didn't look up. "Don't reckon I deserve to." After a while, she rose and went to the river. He followed, not close, just enough to see her reflection in the dark water, broken by ripples. "They branded me once," she said suddenly, her voice almost lost in the wind. "After Bitter Mesa. Not with iron, with words. Witch, outcast, liar. You start to believe it after a while." She turned, sleeve slipping back, just enough to show the scar along her forearm. Rope burn. Healed, but angry. "They used to say that rope would remember my neck," she said. "I'd wake up some nights thinking I could still feel it tighten." Boone swallowed hard. "You ever think about revenge?" Cora's gaze was quiet fire. "I think about planting something that lives longer than hate." In that night, the wind rose again, a wild sound, carrying grit and the scent of rain that never came. Boone lay awake, gun beside him, watching the embers die. He heard Cora whisper a prayer, not to be saved, but to be seen. The kind of prayer that crawls out of years of silence. When he finally slept, his dream was fevered. A gallows in a river, ropes turning to snakes, faces he'd arrested, shot, forgotten. And the child again, holding out the page. "You were there too." He woke before dawn, sweat cold on his back. Cora sat near the fire, watching him. "You talk in your sleep," she said. "So do ghosts," he muttered. They broke camp at first light. Boone rode in front, the trail cutting along the river, cottonwoods bending like witnesses. Somewhere ahead lay Fort Laramie, where he was meant to turn her in. The law still had her name on the ledger, but every mile made the thought heavier. At a crossing, Cora's horse slipped, almost falling into the current. Boone grabbed the reins, steadying it. For a moment, their faces were close, her breath sharp with cold, his stubble gray with dust. "Why are you still bringing me in?" she asked. "You saw the truth. You burned the proof." Boone stared at the horizon. "Because if I let you go, they'll hang someone else in your place. Maybe that child next time. Justice don't die easy. It just keeps looking for a neck." Cora's lips tightened. "Then stop calling it justice." They reached the far bank, water dripping from the horses. Boone looked down at the current. watching the charred scraps of the burned rope float past, black and curling, carried away. He knelt, scooped one piece out, and held it between his fingers. It was still warm. He looked at her. "You want to be free?" She didn't answer, just watched the sun rising over the plains. Boone tied the blackened rope into a knot, small enough to fit in his palm, and tucked it into her hand. "Then bury that yourself. Not the proof, the memory." Cora closed her fingers around it. "And you?" "I'll keep the scar," he said. They rode in silence again, the river fading behind them, the desert opening wide and empty ahead. By the time night fell, Red Hollow was 50 miles east, but its ghosts rode with them still. Somewhere in the dark, a coyote howled, lonely and low. Cora looked at Boone and said, almost to herself, "They'll call you a traitor for this." He nodded. "Then they'll finally call me something true." By the third night, the wind had turned colder, that kind of cold that cuts through even the meanest pride. They camped near a half-fallen barn outside of Dunwood, a ghost of a town where the well had dried and the church bell hadn't rung in 5 years. Only the horses seemed alive there, breathing fog into the night air. Boone built a fire and stared into it until the shapes inside the flames began to look like faces. The Reverend's, the children's, his own. Cora sat across from him, arms crossed tight, the burned rope knot still clutched in her hand. The small thing looked harmless now, but Boone knew how heavy it must have felt. The weight of a story that no one believed. At dawn, they rode into Dunwood proper. A few heads turned, none long enough to remember their own ghosts. The sign over the saloon door had lost its paint, the windows its glass. A dog barked somewhere unseen, then quieted. Boone hitched his horse outside the general store and looked toward the churchyard at the edge of town. A man was there, old, bent, sweeping dust off stone markers. Boone knew that gait. He knew the limp. Sheriff Danton. The old lawman looked up slow when he heard the boots on gravel. His beard was white now, but the eyes, same shade of iron as before. "Well, I'll be damned," Danton said. "Elias Boone. Thought you'd quit chasing ghosts." Boone stopped a few feet away. "Didn't come to chase, came to finish." Danton's gaze drifted to Cora, who waited by the horses. The color drained from his face like whiskey from a cracked flask. "You," he rasped. "You should be dead." Cora's voice was steady. "So should you." The street went silent. A curtain shifted in a window. Boone felt the weight of the badge that wasn't on his chest anymore. "You blamed her," Boone said. "You burned the mine to hide your sins." Danton snorted. "I did what had to be done. The mine was poison. The town needed someone to hate. And you?" He pointed a shaking finger. "You swore the warrant." Boone's jaw tightened. "I didn't read the fine print." "None of us did," Danton said. "That's how towns survive, Marshal. They forget." Cora stepped forward, her shadow cutting across the dust. "You buried children to save a lie." Danton's hand drifted to his hip, not for a gun, but for the old flask hanging there. He took a slow drink, then spat it onto the ground. "They weren't my children," he muttered. "Just bones. Bones don't talk." Cora's eyes went cold. "Then hear them now!" She reached into her coat and threw something at his feet, a handful of white fragments Boone had seen her gather at Bitter Mesa before dawn. Bone shards, small as pebbles, wrapped in a scrap of linen. Danton staggered back. The flask slipped from his hand. Boone didn't draw his gun. He didn't have to. The town had gone quiet, the kind of silence that means something's being remembered. From the store porch, an old woman whispered, "Those are children's bones." Another voice rose, a man's hoarse. "He said the witch did it." A pause. Then, maybe she didn't. And just like that, the air changed. No shouting, no mob, just doubt. Small, trembling, but real. Danton looked around, wild now. "You people forget what she is. You forget." Boone cut him off. "No, they finally remembered what you were." The sheriff tried to speak again, but the words never came. His knees buckled. The flask rolled into the dust. The smell of whiskey mixed with the dry wind. By noon, Boone and Cora were gone. They didn't look back. The town of Dunwood had started talking to itself again, and that was enough. They stopped by the river an hour later. Boone leaned against his horse, tired past words. "You think that changed anything?" he asked. Cora looked out at the water. It changed the silence. She knelt and opened her hand. The burned rope knot, black, charred, she buried it beneath a flat river stone. Her fingers trembled, but not from fear. When she stood, Boone saw the scar on her wrist catch the sunlight. "Now," she said, "it belongs to the earth." Boone turned toward his horse, adjusting the saddle straps. "What'll you do now?" "Find a place that doesn't know my name," she said. "Start from something small. Maybe a garden?" He nodded slow. "Good ground's hard to find out here." Cora smiled faintly. "Then I'll make it." They parted near the fork in the trail. One path toward the open plains, the other toward the border towns. Boone watched her go until the dust swallowed her shape. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the badge he'd left on the graves. Somehow it was back. The child must have slipped it into his saddlebag. The silver was tarnished now, the star edges dulled. He looked at it a long while, then threw it into the river. It vanished without a sound. The current carried it east, back toward the towns that forgot their sins. The wind came softer now, cooler, cleaner, the kind that carries endings and beginnings in the same breath. Weeks had passed since Bitter Mesa burned, but the land still smelled faintly of smoke when Boone rode the western ridge alone. The desert stretched endless and pale, like a page waiting for the next story no one would dare to write. He hadn't worn the badge since Dunwood. His coat hung lighter without it, though his soul did not. He'd stopped chasing names and started following rivers. Water didn't ask questions, and it didn't lie. By evening, he reached a small valley rimmed with cottonwoods and sage. The smoke of a campfire curled upward, soft as a prayer. He knew that scent before he saw her. Cora Finch was kneeling by a garden, no wider than a wagon bed, rows of green pushing through black earth. Her hair was loose, her dress simple, her hands dirty but steady. She looked up when she heard his horse. A flicker of surprise crossed her face, then something gentler. "You found me," she said. "Didn't have to look far," Boone replied, dismounting. "Desert's got a way of showing what it wants to keep." He watched her work the soil in silence. The evening light turned everything gold, even the scar on her wrist, the one she no longer tried to hide. That garden, he said after a while. It'll take months before it grows proper. Cora smiled faintly. Good things should take their time. That's how you know they're worth something. She pointed toward the far end of the patch. Beneath one of the young cottonwoods, half buried in earth, was the river stone, the one she'd placed the rope knot under. A tiny sprig had grown there, something wild, defiant, and green. Boone knelt beside it, brushing dust from the stone. You kept your word, he murmured. Cora looked past him toward the horizon. I just stopped letting them own my silence. They sat by the fire as night fell. Coyotes cried from the ridges, not mournful this time, just alive. Boone poured coffee from a tin pot, the steam catching moonlight. He glanced at her hands, scarred, strong, alive. You ever think about leaving? He asked. Cora stirred the fire with a stick. I did once, but now I think about staying, about tending what no one else would bother planting. Boone nodded slowly. That's braver than any gunfight I ever saw. She smiled, tired, honest. Maybe we both stopped fighting the wrong thing. For a while, they said nothing. The desert hummed with crickets. The stars spilled endless across the black. Boone touched the side of his neck. A faint scar there. Rope burned from the day the mob nearly turned on him after Dunwood. He hadn't told her about it. He didn't need to. Scars had a way of recognizing each other. He took off his hat, held it in his lap. They'll write the story wrong, you know. They always do. Cora's gaze met his. Then let them. The truth don't need ink, just witnesses. When dawn came, he saddled up again. The air smelled of sage and river dust. Cora stood beside the garden, hands in her pockets, watching him. He tipped his hat. You got water, fire, seed. That's more than most. She nodded. You got your road. He paused, then said softly, If you ever hear thunder, look east. Might be me, still chasing what's left of justice. Cora smiled. Then I'll plant something for it. Boone rode off slow, the rising sun turning his shadow long against the plain. At the edge of her homestead, he looked back one last time. Cora was kneeling by the little sprig again, pressing the soil firm around it. The wind lifted her hair, carrying her hum, low, wordless, but full of life. He touched the scar on his neck, then rode on, leaving the tracks to fade behind him like smoke. Years later, they said the widow witch of Red Hollow built a garden where nothing grew before, that travelers stopped there for water and left with silence in their bones, the peaceful kind. And some swore that on quiet nights, when the wind turned west, you could hear two voices near the river, one woman's hum and the low reply of a man's laugh, tired but forgiven. Maybe mercy don't ride on horses, Boone had once written in the margin of that old outlaw journal before leaving it on her doorstep. Maybe it grows in places where someone decided not to burn again. On the fire died down. The story ended the only way desert stories ever do, not with victory, but with breath. And if you ever ride through Bitter Mesa and see a small patch of green by the river, don't ask who planted it. Just know somebody once did, and that it cost them everything, and that somehow that was enough.